So, on the 6th of February, 1958, British European Airways Flight 609 crashed on its third attempt to take off from a slush-covered runway at Munich Airport in West Germany. There were 44 people on board that day. They were supporters, they were journalists, and they were the Manchester United football team. The team was returning home from an away match at Red Star Belgrade in Yugoslavia. The team, affectionately known at the time as the Busby Babes, they were named so because the side was built entirely out of gifted young players that had been developed by the club itself rather than having been brought in from other places. The truth was that the Busby Babes were not only the next generation of Manchester United, but they were already an extremely successful team. By this point in that season, they had already held the Charity Shield. They were well on course to win their third successive league title, and they had just advanced to their second successive European Cup final. Of the 44 people on board that day, 23 were killed. 21, the other 21 were all injured. In one evening, the present and future core of Manchester United was absolutely decimated. See, the truth is, it's not like how we know football now. The loss of those players meant that the team, this successful, could not actually field 11 players for the rest of the season. They didn't have 11 players left to play. The financial cost was devastating. They couldn't even afford to buy players to bring them in. Being unable to compete as they would have been for the rest of the season, we see that clubs like Real Madrid and Liverpool helped United to be able to field teams for the rest of the season. We see Real Madrid actually made golden pendants with the names of the deceased. These pendants were called Champions of Honor, and they were sold all throughout Spain to raise money for the club. Liverpool offered to loan United 5 players to make up a team, with the legendary Liverpool manager at the time, Bill Shankly, offering to pay their wages. That was 1958. Now, Manchester United is in one of the top 10 of the world's most valuable sports franchises. According to Forbes, it's not only the most recognizable sports franchise in the world. It is the most supported franchise. It's a far cry from that night in Munich, isn't it? It's possibly the greatest rebuild effort in the history of sport. Rebuild. That's a word I want us to consider for the next couple of weeks. See, at the start of this year, as I was praying and I was asking God what this year had in store for us, I felt God lead me to the book of Nehemiah. And as I read Nehemiah, I felt God speaking to me, and God was saying, Dwight, this is a year of rebuilding. This is the year of rebuilding. And it was a powerful word, and it made me excited to think of what this year held in store for us. You know, and as the years progressed, it's funny how I've noticed how other churches have started talking about certain things. I've started looking at the themes of so many other different churches and organizations, conferences. And you know what they're all focusing on? Nehemiah. And you know what the theme for the year, for the season they believe is? Rebuild. Now is the time for rebuilding. So what I want to say to you this morning is I think this concept of rebuilding is a word from the Lord to the church. The church. Not a church or even this church, but the church as a whole. And I think that's something very special. I think it's something very special that the church as a whole has a word from the Lord, specifically for the season that we are in right now. Because for the last 2 years, the church has faced the same challenges all across the world. You could go to any church in any country, anywhere in the world, and they were facing the same challenges as we did in little old Boersig. As one. In one sense, I think it's true to say that mankind has been unified in our suffering in a way we would never have even dreamed possible before COVID. And so it's no surprise to me, because we've all been in the same place, that God has the same word for us no matter where we are in the world. And that word for the season is rebuild. So if the word for the church, and that includes all of us sitting here this morning, is rebuild, why aren't we talking about Nehemiah this morning? Uncle Ray? Why aren't we talking about Nehemiah this morning? Why is what we're doing next not about Ezra? And for some of you sitting here, the question might actually be, who is Haggai, and is that even a real book of the Bible? Because Pastor Paul's played that trick on me before, you know. So let me tell you, for starters, yes, it is a real book of the Bible, I promise you, okay? And I will promise you one thing further. I think as we talk about it over the next couple of weeks, you might see exactly why we're zeroing in on Haggai in the season of rebuilding. But before we actually go to the book this morning, we need to understand the background. We need to understand why Haggai was written. We need to understand what was happening at the time. And now, so let me give you the background. Babylon, under Nebuchadnezzar, had destroyed Jerusalem. They'd come in and they'd absolutely obliterated everything. When I say everything, I mean everything. I mean they left nothing. They destroyed the temple. They destroyed the walls. They destroyed the city. They destroyed the people. And the people that they didn't destroy, they actually took with them into captivity, into Babylon. They removed them from their own country. When I say that Jerusalem, after Nebuchadnezzar was done, was desolate, I'm not kidding. Okay, people, those who were left, who weren't deemed worthy enough to even be dragged across to Babylon, were sitting on rubble. There was nothing left. And they stayed in Babylon for 70 years. But you see, God had not forgotten Israel. See, through Isaiah, God had promised that a strong and powerful king named Cyrus would come along and defeat Babylon. This was a drastic claim that anybody, any nation could possibly stand up to Babylon would be mad, let alone he named the very king who was going to do it long before he was born. But let me tell you something about God, if maybe this is the first time you're joining us this morning. His promises are always true to the very last letter. And let me tell you, that's exactly what happened. A king named Cyrus did rise up, did defeat the Babylonians. And something truly spectacular happened. Instead of incorporating these exiles, these people who'd been carried off into Babylon, who'd spent 70 years in servitude for the most part in Babylon, instead of incorporating them into his empire, he turns around and says, you guys are free to go. Go home if you want to. I mean, home, such as it is. So 43,000 returned to Judah with the express purpose to rebuild the temple and the ruins of what was left of Jerusalem. And so we see on their seventh month after arriving, Zerubbabel, who was the governor, he was the governor of this people, this remnant that had come back, and Joshua, he was the high priest. And they led the people in the 7th month when they arrived to build an altar so that they could worship the Lord. We see in the 2nd year after they arrived, we see that these people lead the people to building the foundation of the temple. We see that the foundation of the temple gets laid. And then we get along to Haggai, because the word of the Lord that came to Haggai, when Haggai first speaks, is 16 years after that foundation was laid. So let's get into the text this morning. We're going to read the first couple of verses of Haggai. So Haggai chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. It says, in the 2nd year of King Darius, on the 1st day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the priest. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has not yet come for the Lord's house to be built. Now, hang on a second. Whoa. Hang on. Right now, you're probably thinking, didn't I just say a few minutes ago that Haggai prophesied 16 years after the foundations of the temple were laid? You're right. I did say that. And you're probably wondering, didn't I say that in the 7th month after they arrived that they built an altar to worship the Lord? No, you're right. That's exactly what I said. And you're probably also wondering, didn't I say when I was explaining, didn't I say that in the second year after they arrived, those foundations were laid? You're right. And you know what? Your math is right, too. Despite laying the foundation and starting the rebuilding work, by the time God speaks through Haggai, 16 more years have passed and not a thing has been done about the temple. Nothing. Abandoned. All right, let's carry on. Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it a time for yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? Now this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. See, that's the first time you've heard a very important phrase that you are going to hear repeated 4 more times throughout the book of Haggai, and that phrase is that phrase is the Lord Almighty. And so it's an important phrase because it's used throughout the book. As a matter of fact, it's used multiple times throughout the book of Haggai. And I want you to understand something. Haggai picks this phrase, the Lord Almighty, very carefully. He's chosen it well. See, what we need to understand is that this was a defeated people, right? They'd spent, first of all, they were living in what was essentially rubble. They'd arrived to what was nothing. They'd had to build everything from scratch. Before that, they were foreigners and outcasts in someone else's land, which is pretty much what most of them were born into. Very few remembered what it was like before that. But for the unfortunate few who remembered what it was like before then, what do you think they remembered? War, siege, famine, defeat, humiliation. And you're about to see a little bit later that things weren't going much better for them now. This was a defeated people. If it was possible for an entire nation to be depressed, then I imagine that this is exactly what these people were. Their city was a wreck. They had no walls, no defense. This was a powerless people. So what do you say to a powerless people? You say, remember, there's the Lord Almighty. It was so important to them. Haggai is reminding them, a powerless and oppressed people, that despite how they may be feeling, there is a Lord Almighty in the mix. And that Lord Almighty, that reminder, is a reminder that Lord Almighty changes everything. And so let me segue for a second here this morning and say to you, because I don't know where you're coming from this morning, maybe today, maybe you need to be reminded that there is a Lord Almighty. You see, the problem is never that there isn't a Lord Almighty. The Lord Almighty is always there. Sometimes we just don't see it. Sometimes we just don't feel it. Sometimes we just don't find ourselves in a place where we can be reminded that there's a Lord Almighty. Sometimes we find ourselves in a place where we actually feel like I'm just finished. All I've known is things going wrong. All I've known is the hard times. And so let me say to you this morning, if you want to know the most practical thing you can do right now is remind yourself that there's a Lord Almighty. Because He's not powerless. I digress. Let me come back. There's also another phrase in the little section we just read now. This is the phrase that's repeated 4 times in just this one book. And it's a very important phrase. It's give careful thought. It means to consider, to take stock. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read those words, give careful thought, it kind of seems like the opposite of rebuild, doesn't it? Is it just me? They don't really seem to be the same picture to me. See, to me, rebuild is all about getting stuck in. It's about getting your hands dirty. It's about working hard. It's about getting on with the job. Well, give careful thought. That's kind of like passive. There doesn't seem to be much action involved. I'm just sitting back, giving careful thought, not really doing anything. We're just thinking. We're not really producing anything, are we? This is what God says to these people through Haggai. People who, let me tell you something, were busy. They were working hard. They were building houses, and they weren't just building shelters. No, they were building some beautiful homes. They are making them all beautiful, and in a sense, they're actually trying to bring back some sense of architectural culture back to Jerusalem. Because you know what I mean, and I'm sure Ryan could tell us all about this kind of thing, that architecture has its own culture, and they're trying to bring back some of the beauty, some of the craftsmanship, some of the splendor that they might have remembered from previous days. And not just that, we'll see in the next few verses that they were hard at work. They were planting fields. They tried to get an economy up and running again. These are hard-working people. They're working hard to rebuild a shattered nation. You see, the truth is that they'd actually left the relative comfort of Babylon to come back here and rebuild. They didn't have to leave Babylon. They could have stayed. They could have stayed in the comfort, but they left it knowing full well that they would need to rebuild. Knowing full well what a huge task that was going to be. They were working as though their lives depended on it. Because let me tell you something, they really did. To these hard-working people, God says, give careful thought. So what is it that God wants them to give careful thought to? What should they be thinking about? The answer is their ways. Now, the word we translate in English as ways is the word darak. Okay? So, can you say darak? Darak? Okay. All right. This is what darak means. It means the journey, the manner, the way, or the course of life. So essentially, what God is saying to these people is that they need to, through Haggai, is that they need to give careful thought, not to what they are busy doing, not what they are busy doing with their hands on the moment. It's not about the action, it's about the why. It's about why they are doing what they're doing and where that why is taking them. God is asking them to take a step back and to look where they have come from, to look where they are going, and to consider what is motivating them and where those motivations will ultimately lead them. Why is God asking them to do this? We have the answer in the next couple of verses. Verse 6. You have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never have your full. You put on clothes, but you aren't warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse that has holes in it. And the answer is simple. It's not because they aren't working. It's not because they aren't putting effort in. But the thing is that despite all their effort, it's just not working out. Despite how hard they are trying, despite all the rebuilding and the rebuilding and the rebuilding, despite all the effort they are putting in, it's just not enough. No matter how hard they work, no matter how hard they try, no matter how much they rebuild, it's never going to be enough. No matter what they do, they will never have enough. No matter what they do, they will never be satisfied. See, for all their hard work, they are reaping an inferior reward. This is part of the reason for that title, the Lord Almighty. It's the part of the reason why it's so important, because these people were feeling hopeless. You see, Haggai didn't tell them, listen, you guys are doing all this work and not getting enough in return. And they were like, no, actually, we're fine. No, when they heard this, they were like, you're absolutely right. You're right. We're working so hard, but it's not living up to expectation. We're doing everything we can, but it's not enough. We're rebuilding. Why isn't this working? Why isn't throwing myself completely into this? Why is it not enough? No, they knew. And so they were feeling hopeless. And again, the question becomes, why? Why, despite all those rebuilding efforts, was this not working? Let's look at what God has to say about it. This is verse 7 to 11. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. Go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build the house, so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord. You expected much, but it turned out to be little. What you brought home, I blew away. Why, declares the Lord Almighty? Because of my house, which remains in ruins, while each of you is busy with his own house. Therefore, because of you, the heavens have withheld their dew, and the earth its crops. I have called for a drought on the fields and the mountains, on the grain and the new wine, the oil and whatever the ground produces, on the men and the cattle and all the labor of your hands. Sure. Imagine that. Imagine you've come and you rebuilding and you throwing everything into it. And after 16 years, God speaks and he says, you know what? You can keep trying to rebuild everything you want. You're going nowhere. And I'm not going to let you go anywhere. You think this is about rebuilding. You don't get what's really going on here. There's a problem between me and you. Right? And when there's a problem between me and you, you better believe that you're just spinning your wheels but going nowhere. God says, I'm the reason none of this is working out. Why, despite all your efforts, does nothing satisfy? Because of my house, which remains in ruin, while each of you are busy with your own house. Well done. You see, you picked this up all the way back in verse 2. Do you remember? 16 years. They'd laid a foundation. They'd started building the temple. But then for 16 years, they'd done nothing. Nothing. The rebuild of the temple went absolutely, completely abandoned. Now, I don't know how many of you guys have ever seen a building that's been abandoned for a few years. Now, one of my favorite programs on television is called Abandoned Engineering. I love it because it's very interesting, okay? And you'll see, they'll show you a building and the whole thing's crumbling down and it's overgrown and there's like water damage and they're like, yeah, this building's been abandoned for 10 years. Let me tell you something about abandoned buildings or about abandoned construction. It's not just sitting there all perfect, waiting for you to come back and finish the job. You leave something alone for 16 years, you better believe you're going to have water damage. You better believe it's going to be overgrown. You better believe you're going to have to do so much restoration work and fixing work before you can even think or dream. You might even have to replace part of it before you can even start thinking about building something. That was the state the temple was in by the time God spoke through Haggai. After a promising start when they first arrived back for 16 years, it stood abandoned while the people carried on with other things and forgot all about the temple. Why would they do this? Why would you be so passionate to start something? You build an altar, you lay the foundation, and then you just stop. Why would you do this? Well, there are a couple of important reasons. Some you get in the text, some you have to dig a little bit deeper to understand. But the first is this, and this is the one we see very clearly. It's that they were busy. As I said in the beginning, the Babylonians had destroyed everything. There was nothing to come back to. You couldn't come back to homes. You couldn't come back to shops. There was no markets. There was no trade. There was no infrastructure. There was no judicial system. There was no policing. There was nothing. Nothing that makes society happen existed when they arrived back. But more than that, even the fields themselves, which they would depend on their livelihood, were destroyed. You see, it's not only did the Babylonians come along and when they took the city, they burned the fields or took the crops maybe for themselves, and then they burned the fields and then they left. And so for the last 70 years, these fields have just been sitting there, just waiting to be planted again. That wasn't the case. No, what they would have done is they would have, after conquering the city, they would have scattered stones across every fruit or grain-producing field that they could find. And if you know anything about farming, you know you can't build on builder's rubble. You've got to clean that field first. Every stone has got to be taken out. So now I want you to put yourself in the shoes of these people. You know what? It was impossible for them to do anything in that state. That field had to be cleared, one field at a time, before you could plant anything. And in the meantime, oh, by the way, you still have to eat. You realize you can't go a whole season without eating and just wait for the next crop to come along. You've got to eat in the meantime. time. So while they cleared one field, they planted it and tended it, they would have to find some time to go and clear the next field so that next season they could plant something else. And so they would have to go along. And all the while they're doing this, they still have to rebuild their homes and their infrastructure and look after their kids and do everything else. They were busy. The second problem was the magnitude of the task. See, rebuilding the temple was a major task. For an undertaking that big in the ancient world, you would have needed resources and lots and lots and lots of them. From a finance point of view, most of what these people would have brought with from Babylon would have been invested immediately into just surviving, into purchasing enough food and building materials to build shelters and to give them food to sort of last for the next time. There wouldn't have been an abundance of finances. If there was anything left, it probably would have been used to try and resurrect the economy a little bit. From a natural resources point of view, there was another problem. Lumber, to be specific. You see, in taking Jerusalem, not only did Babylon cut down all the trees that they needed to support their war effort, but afterwards they destroyed all the forests. Everything was gone. The truth is, there simply just wasn't enough natural resources to build the temple, to take on a task of that magnitude. You see, what it probably would have meant was, it would have meant bringing cedar from Lebanon. And that would have cost time and money. You see, the first thing is, it has to be chopped down. So people have to go there and chop it down, right? Then, in order to transport it, it probably needs to be transported by sea. So it needs to be taken across to the coast, then put on ships. What ships? Who's paying for these ships, right? Then it needs to be floated down, and again, it lands on the coast. And now, if you know anything about Jerusalem, it doesn't sit right on the beach. It's not a seaside town, okay? It then has to be dragged across inland, and then eventually up what is essentially a mountain, and that's just to get it to the temple site. Who's going to pay for that? Who's got the time to go and do this job? They were spending everything they had everywhere else. It must have felt a tad overwhelming, just thinking about it, just calculating the cost involved. And you see, there was actually easier to accomplish tasks right there. I can't build a temple, but I can build my house. I can't work on the temple, but I can do that extension that I need. I can't build the temple, but what I can do is buy another piece of land so I can plant a bigger crop for next season. It's easier to accomplish tasks. Another reason was opposition from Samaria, and this is the story we know from Ezra. I'm not going to go into it right now. But the Samaritans, though sharing a common ancestry, hated the Jews. And in particular, the temple was a big source of contention between the two people right from the very beginning. And so they use all of their political influence to try and make rebuilding the temple as difficult as they possibly can. So for all these reasons, it must have seemed too difficult trying to rebuild the temple. There were so many challenges. There were so many things to overcome, so many obstacles. And after all, how can they focus on all these difficulties when they actually had so many other things that they could keep themselves busy with? And so for all those reasons, the temple remains abandoned for 16 years. That is until this old man, and we know he was old, because later we learn that Haggai was born at least before the destruction of the first temple. So, before the destruction of the first temple, 70 years in exile, 2 more to lay the foundation, 16 years until he speaks. And again, if you've done your math right, you'll realize that Haggai was probably 88 years old, if not older, by the time God gives him this word. It might explain why his ministry was so short. It was just 4 months, but I digress again. The temple was abandoned for 16 years. And it took an old man. But I want you to notice something, not just any old man, an old man with a word from the Lord. And so I want to say to you this morning, I can't move on until I say this to you this morning. It doesn't matter your age or your stage of life. It doesn't matter where you find yourselves in relation to anything. If the Lord has given you a word for someone or some people or some place, let me tell you something. You have all the authority you need to speak. It's not about, I don't want to step on anybody's toes or how are they going to take it. No, if God's given you a word, you have the authority. And when you speak it, let me tell you, some amazing things happen. It took this old man with a word from the Lord to confront a busy people, to say, hang on, God's got something he wants to say to you. Take a listen. And he tells them something that must have been incredibly difficult to hear, that no matter how hard you try, no matter how much effort you put in, guess what? Your rebuilding will never satisfy. You can keep trying. You can keep putting more effort. You can keep doing what you need to do, but it's never going to satisfy. Because while they're busy with all these other things, the Lord's temple stands abandoned. So how did Zerubbabel, the guy who was supposed to be in charge, leading these people, how did he take it? How did Joshua, the man who was actually supposed to be representing God to the people and the people to God, how did the whole nation of busy people take a rebuke like that, a rap across the knuckles? Well, we find the answer in the last section of the chapter, and this is verses 12 to 15. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and the whole remnant of the people obeyed the voice of the Lord their God and the message of the prophet Haggai, because their Lord, their God, had sent him, and the people feared the Lord. Then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message of the Lord to the people. I am with you, declares the Lord. So the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and the spirit of the whole remnant of the people. And when they came and began to work on the house of the Lord Almighty, their God, on the 24th day of the 6th month in the 2nd year of King Darius. I want to say something to their credit. The people didn't go, forget you, man, old man. What are you doing here? We thought you were dead already. I mean, what are you coming here with this nonsense? You're 88. We don't see you doing anything. We're doing all the work, and now you want to tell us it's not good enough? Please. And I mean, let's be honest. What do you really know about building temples or building anything? Please just go back to the old age home where you belong, and don't come here and bother us anymore. They don't respond like that. No. It says the people, Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the whole remnant obeyed God. They recognized that God was speaking through Haggai, and that these words were not Haggai's words. They were God's words. And so this is a completely different response to how the people responded to the word of the God before the exile. See, before the exile, there were plenty of prophets, and they spoke for a lot longer, and they had a lot longer books. And they all said the same thing. Guys, give careful thought to your darak. God is saying you're going down a bad road. And you know what the response was universally? Nah, it's fine. We're not interested in what God has to say. We're going to keep doing our own thing. God said, the prophets would say, guys, listen here. If you don't listen, God's going to take away the blessing he's put on you. You're going to go into captivity. And the people said, nah, it's okay. And what happens? I told you earlier, God is always true to his promises. And that's exactly what happened. These people respond completely differently to how they did before the exile. They hear God's word. They know it's from God, and they listen to what he says. And something happens. It says they start to fear God again. And fear, it's not how we understand it, something terrible. It's a reverent respect. You see, God's starting to stir up the spirits inside of Zerubbabel. He's stirring up the spirit inside of Joshua. And if that's not enough, he's stirring up the spirit of every single person. And they turn around and they say, you know what? The foundations of the temple, this can't stand like this. We need to do something. You see, what was happening before this was exactly like the foundations of the temple. Their heart was abandoned. Their spirit was empty. There was nothing going on there. But Haggai speaks. And as God speaks, their hearts are stirred. And they start giving careful thought to their ways. And I want to ask us this morning something very important as we come here. How many times do we respond to a rebuke from the Lord this way? Or does it usually sound a bit more like this? But you know, I know what you're saying, but let me explain. Right now, this is going on. And you know what? I don't know why you're looking at me. Look at these other people. I'm not the only one. Why are you singling me out? Or you know what? You just don't seem to understand where I'm coming from. How many times is that our response? These people went, nah. We've heard from the Lord now. We fear the Lord again. Something is stirring up inside of us. And you know that this abandoned foundation is not going to be good enough. And they get to building. That foundation had been abandoned for 16 years. But after God's word comes through Haggai, the people are stirred up by God. They fear God. 16 years abandoned. And let me tell you, that entire temple was rebuilt in 4 years. 4 years. And how that came about is truly marvelous, and we'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. But something I need you to understand is that rebuilding the temple didn't suddenly become easy. Money didn't just start flooding in. Prepared cedar logs didn't start raining from heaven. This didn't just suddenly become an easy task. The challenge hadn't changed. It was still a monumental task, but something had changed. And that made all the difference. You see, for a book you may never have heard of before you arrived here this morning, Haggai records an extremely powerful and extremely important part of God's story. And the rebuild that happens here is one that has an impact that echoes all the way through the New Testament and even into eternity. But what about us? What about us right now? We who are in the space where God is saying to us, rebuild. Rebuild is the word for the season. So what does this first word, this first prophecy of Haggai speak to us? What is it saying to us right now? Well, it's saying a couple of things. The first is this. It's not just about rebuilding. It's about what you are rebuilding. See, rebuilding may be the word that God has given for us for the season, but it's not just about that rebuilding. See, that was really the problem that these exiles faced. It wasn't that they weren't rebuilding. It wasn't that they weren't lazy. They were rebuilding their homes, their farms, their economy. In a way, they were rebuilding their culture as they understood it. They were rebuilding from the second they arrived back in Judea, and every single day for 18 long years. But despite how hard they worked, despite their effort, despite how much they tried to build a kingdom, it all fell short. It just wasn't enough. The reaping, if you will, did not match the sowing. It did not satisfy. They expected much, but it turned out to be little. They planted much, but harvest little. You see, here's the thing. They were so busy rebuilding all these things, all these good things. They were good things. Homes, farms, economy, family, culture. These are good things. They aren't bad things. But they were going about it all the wrong way. And the truth is, they were very much in danger of repeating the mistakes that led to the exile in the first place. See, putting God aside while they tried to build a kingdom instead of building a kingdom on the God Almighty. These people were failing at the very first hurdle that God had given them after He'd given them back their freedom. Not because they weren't rebuilding good things, but because they weren't rebuilding the right ones. So God has told us we're in a season of rebuilding. And yay, that's great. Guys, let's rebuild. Let's start rebuilding. Let's rebuild some stuff. Let's get busy. We're all sitting here. We're all standing around. What are we standing around for? Let's get to some rebuilding. But what? What are we rebuilding? We can't just stop at that this is a season of rebuilding. We need to go deeper and ask exactly what is it that we are rebuilding. We need to give careful thought. So what is it we're trying to rebuild? Are we as the church just trying to rebuild service numbers? Because, I don't want to look at empty pews in the front here when I stand here. It's not nice. Are we just trying to rebuild the programs, the amount of programs we used to run? Oh, well, we used to run this program and that program and that program and that program and that program. Now we have to just run one program because, we can't do it. Are we trying to rebuild the amount of people we have in our serving teams? Oh, I used to have 20 leaders, now I've got 6, I need to get some more people up in my serving teams because I can get some stuff done. Yes, you're right. Those are all areas that need a rebuild. All of those areas need to see growth. But the truth is, if we focus on just rebuilding what we used to have, then I'm sorry, we're just making the same mistakes the exiles did. And we're building on shaky foundations. And the truth is, no matter how much effort we put into that, it's never going to be enough. See, but the church isn't the only place that needs some rebuilding work, isn't it? In fact, there are some areas, maybe a little bit closer to home, that need some rebuilds. What about things like our careers? How many people have suffered in their career? If you're a business owner, what about your business? How many businesses need a rebuild? Need to get things going again, need to start getting income coming back in. What about your physical health after a health scare? What about family life after the death of a loved one? That needs a rebuild. Or rebuilding yourself and your self-esteem after divorce. Or one we never seem to talk about. What about the rebuild that needs to happen once all your children leave home and suddenly it's just the two of you alone in this house where for the longest time all you can remember is being a mom and a dad and looking after things and good night my boy, good night my girl, and now suddenly you're all alone in the home and there's a whole new life that needs to be rebuilt around that. Something else we don't often talk about. What about our mental health? Things have been difficult. The losses, the lockdowns, the isolations, people's mental health has suffered. What about something as simple as our new normal? Just rebuilding a new normal. What does life look like in the future? What does it look like where we're going? There are so many areas in our lives in such desperate need of a rebuild. And the truth is, I think we all want to do the work. We're all desperate to do the work. We want to rebuild these things. But if we don't heed the warning of Haggai, we might find that despite all our best intentions, all our hard work, we aren't getting to where we want to be. That the growth just isn't happening. The blessing is just not coming. So how do we go about fulfilling this word that God has given us for 2022, that we are in the season of rebuilding? Not just as a church, the institution, but in our own lives and families as well. Well, you won't be surprised to know that the answer is the same for both. We begin with the temple. Now, I'm not talking about the literal temple. I do not have the construction skills for that. The returning exiles abandoned the temple to work on other things. How does Haggai put it? What is it? What they said? They said, it's not yet time. Basically, what they were saying was, we're kind of busy with other stuff right now. We kind of got a lot of other things going on. There's a lot of other priorities. This temple thing, this isn't really essential. Do you remember that? What's essential? They were building homes. After all, they needed a place to live. I mean, that makes sense, right? But their problem wasn't just that they were building basic dwellings, but what they were doing was making these homes more and more opulent. What they were doing was building up their own portfolios more and more. What essentially they were doing, if you allow me to be so blunt, was finding every excuse under the book not to bother with the temple. Every excuse to keep them busy so we don't have to deal with rebuilding the temple. Like those exiles, we have a tendency to focus on the rebuild, what's right in front of us, and not the God of the rebuild. We put off showing devotion to Him. We put off worshiping Him. I'm going to be plain with you. We put off serving in the kingdom. And I'm sorry, just being a Christian is not enough. That does not qualify. That's not the sum total of serving in the kingdom. I'm sorry, in case you didn't know that. No, we serve each other. We serve God in the kingdom. And we put it off because we are busy with other things. Yes, good things. Yes, important things. But the focus is sometimes wrong. Instead of focusing on the things we need to rebuild, we need to focus on the rebuilding of the temple, which is essentially rebuilding our lives on a godly foundation. You see, not as part of our lives, one aspect of our lives, but as the very center of it. And the truth is, if we cannot learn from the word that God spoke through Haggai, we'll find ourselves looking back at the season of rebuilding, and you know what you're going to see? You missed it. You're going to see it didn't satisfy. You're going to see it didn't get you where you wanted to go. You're going to see that some other rebuilding in other places happened, and it got somewhere, and the rebuilding that you were doing did not get where you wanted it to be. Man, this is a season of rebuilding, and that's exciting. But I want to challenge us this morning. Let's not miss it. Let's not miss that rebuild. Let's not miss what God is wanting to do, because we are focused on the rebuild and not the God of the rebuild. I would hate for us to look back and realize that we expected a lot, but ended up with a little. But there's another thing I want to share with you this morning. Last year, I spoke to you about waiting. How many of you remember that? I see a few nods. Whew, thank goodness. And how the wait often makes a difference. I said to you, if you remember, that waiting, though, is not passive. I said that while we wait, there are things we do while we wait. That godly waiting is an active waiting. Today, I want to tell you to beware of the wait. But this time, I'm not talking about that godly waiting. No, I'm talking about the other kind. You know the one I mean. The one that says, we'll wait and see what happens. See, that's exactly what the exiles were doing, isn't it? It's not yet time. They were waiting for some unspecified time in the future where suddenly everything would become easy, when suddenly rebuilding the temple actually wouldn't have to be an effort. They could kind of just check the box off. You know, the money was going to be there, the resources were going to be there, the people were going to be there, everything was going to be there, and they could say, oh, well, now we're ready to do the temple. Let's check the box off. Effort done, we can move on. And as hard as it is to imagine, sometimes waiting is not a good thing. But how is that possible? When we think of waiting, I think of words like patience, prudence. Those are all good words. How can waiting not be a good thing? Let me tell you, waiting is not a good thing when what you should actually be doing is moving. Then waiting is not a good thing. Waiting is not a good thing when what you actually should be doing is serving. Waiting is not a good thing when what you should actually be doing is rebuilding. They were waiting when they should have been rebuilding, and God tells them to give careful thought to the rock. What is God calling you to this season? Is He calling you to wait? Or is He calling you to move? Because let me tell you something, even if it is waiting, you best believe that waiting is not passive. No. See, waiting is not procrastination. What it is positioning yourself and actively waiting, ready to move as soon as God speaks. That's what godly waiting is. See, this is a season of rebuilding. And if you don't get it from what I've said to you this morning, I'm sorry. I haven't communicated it well then. But I am excited about this. I'm incredibly excited for it. But before we get carried away with all of these rebuilds, we need to ask, what are we rebuilding? What are we as a church rebuilding? What are you as a person? What is your family rebuilding? Because the simple truth is that God spoke through Haggai all those years. That simple truth applies to us today. Are you trying to rebuild good things? Or are you rebuilding the right ones? Because if we're just trying to rebuild what we once had, or trying to rebuild while all these other areas, these areas of worship, these areas of devotion, these areas of service to God and to others remain abandoned, we're rebuilding on crumbling foundations. And no matter how much we work at it, no matter how much we give, no matter how much we try, no matter how much effort we put in, it will never be enough, because satisfaction is found on building on the rock. But we also need to stop using waiting as a use for inaction. Godly waiting is active waiting, and I want to encourage us all to do that when you find yourself in that place. But the truth is that as much as God sometimes wants you to wait, sometimes He wants you to move. Sometimes He wants you to get on with it. Sometimes it's time to do things. Sometimes it's time to stop waiting for what we don't have, for the people we don't have, for the resources we don't have, for the motivation even, dare I say it, that we don't have. Sometimes we need to stop waiting for all the things we don't have and get on with what God has called us to do. We can't use an excuse, waiting as an excuse to stay in comfortable places. Don't miss the opportunity to move because you are afraid of what God is calling you to do. See, for 16 years, the temple seemed like an impossible task. It was impossible. You couldn't dream of how it was possible. You couldn't imagine how you could achieve something like this. But that was until they positioned themselves properly under God. And then what was impossible was completed in a quarter of a time, the time that they spent waiting and procrastinating over it. God is calling us to rebuild.